Hello, in this video I'll give you an overview of controllers in .NET 5 MVC. In the Startup class, you can see there is a default root pattern defined. It says that the default controller is called Home. The default action is called Index. And that there is an optional root parameter called ID. The default project template includes a controller called Home, with the index, privacy, and error actions. To create a new controller, create a class in the controllers directory. I'll call mine test controller. The name of the class must end with controller. To access all functionality, the class must extend from the base controller class, which is in the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC namespace. I'll create an action called test page 1 that returns a string. This will be returned as a plain text HTTP response. I'll also create another action called index, which also returns a string. Since the action name is called index, this action will be called by default when there is no action name provided in the URL. I'll now navigate to the URL, test. Since we provide no action name in the URL, the action, index, is called by default. I'll now call the other action, by specifying the action name in the URL. In the default routing pattern, there is a definition for an optional ID parameter. This means we can receive an ID parameter in the signature of our action methods. I will change the code so that the value of the parameter is appended to the response. Now when I pass the value in the URL, the value is shown in the response. We can customize the routing pattern by using the root attribute on our controller actions. Now, when we navigate to the old route, we get a 404 error page. The page can now be accessed using the route defined in our attribute. We can also define parameters in our attribute the same way as before. I'll define two parameters, P1 and P2, and then show the values in the output. We can also give controllers base routes so that all actions within a controller have a certain prefix. To show you this, I'll give this controller a prefix of ABC, and I'll name the two action method routes XYZ and 123. We can now access both of the routes using the prefix ABC. We can also access query string parameters by defining them in the method signature in actions. To demonstrate this, I'll define two parameters, x and y, and output them in the response. As shown, you can see the value of the parameters in the response. If we don't provide a parameter, it will have the default value for that type. In our case, it will be an empty string. We can also define a default value in our method signature. By default, we can access our actions using any HTTP method such as GET or POST. We can restrict an action to a certain HTTP method by using a HTTP method attribute. To demonstrate this, I'll restrict this method to POST. Now, when we try to access the action using the HTTP GET method, we get a 405 method not allowed error. Of course, when we use the POST method, it works as expected. We can also pass parameters using the POST form data. However, we can't pass parameters using a JSON body without making some changes. As you can see, the value has not been picked up. To fix this, we first need to create a model class for our JSON body. The model class will be a plain old C# object, with one property, of type string, called y. We then define the class as input in our action method signature with the from body attribute. Now, you can see the value is picked up. Up until now, we have only been returning plain text responses, but of course we can return other things like JSON responses and HTML views. To do this, we change the return type of the action to iActionResult. This type captures a range of responses. Now, to return a plain text response, we use the content method. To return a JSON response, we use the JSON method. In the next video, we'll look at how views work.